The memory of that day doesn't begin with the news, or the command, or even the silence that followed. It begins with the road. It always begins with the road. It was one of those late summer afternoons where the light seems to have a physical weight to it, a thick, golden syrup pouring itself over the world, slowing everything down to a crawl. We were somewhere in the American Southwest. I can't tell you exactly where. The geography had blurred into a mesmerizing, hypnotic loop of sandstone mesas, stubborn juniper trees clinging to red dirt, and a sky so vast and impossibly blue it felt like you could fall up into it forever. The two-lane blacktop highway was a solitary gray ribbon, stitched across a boundless, ancient landscape, and we were the only stitch moving through it. I was behind the wheel of my father's old Chevrolet, a boat of a car from a time when metal was heavy and engines had a soul. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a member of the family. The dashboard was a landscape of cracked, warm vinyl and fake wood paneling. The scent inside was a sacred, familiar alchemy. A base note of aged leather seats, sun-baked for decades, layered with the sharp, clean tang of my father's Old Spice aftershave, and the faint, ever-present ghost of gasoline from a cap that never sealed quite right. It was the smell of my childhood, of safety, of him. The radio was on, but low, tuned to a crackling AM station that was slowly being swallowed by the miles. A country singer's lonesome twang fought its way through the static, singing about lost love and long highways. A soundtrack so perfectly cliché it felt ordained. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was a constant, droning bass note, a sound so steady it had ceased to be a sound and had become a feeling, a vibration you felt in your bones. Thrum, 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 thrum. A metronome marking the passage of an effortless, empty time. My father was in the passenger seat. He wasn't sleeping. He never slept on road trips. He was watching the landscape unspool, his gaze fixed on some distant point on the horizon that only he could see. This was our ritual. Once a year we'd pick a direction and just go. No rigid itinerary, no frantic tourist stops. The purpose was the motion itself. The purpose was the silence between us. And it was a comfortable silence. It had taken years to become comfortable. In my teens, it was a silence of resentment and unspoken arguments. In my 20s, a silence of different lives and polite distance. But now, in my 30s, we had finally found a peaceful, unspoken truce. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of things that didn't need to be said. It was the language of shared history, of knowing a person so well you could hear their thoughts in the rhythm of their breathing. I glanced over at him. His window was down a couple of inches, and the desert air whipped through the cabin, a dry, hot breath that carried the scent of dust and sagebrush. His left arm was resting on the windowsill, his hand tapping a slow, absent-minded rhythm on the outside of the door. His profile was sharp against the blazing window, the familiar, stubborn set of his jaw, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of a lifetime of squinting into sunsets or problems, the short-cropped gray hair that refused to be anything but practical. He was a man built of quiet certainty. A retired engineer, he saw the world in systems, in cause and effect, in things that could be measured, fixed, and understood. He wasn't a man of great emotion or flowery words. His love was a practical, quiet engine. It was in the way he'd top up the oil in my car without being asked, the way he'd remember I liked the crusts cut off my sandwiches as a kid, the way he'd sit in that passenger seat, steadfast and present, simply sharing the miles with me. In that moment, cocooned in our metal and glass shell, hurtling through a painting of breathtaking beauty, everything felt right. The anxieties of my life back home, the mortgage, the deadlines, the relentless churn of adult responsibility, had all been shrunken down to irrelevance by the sheer monumental scale of the desert. There was only the road, the sky, the hum of the engine, and the solid, reassuring presence of my father. It was a perfect, fragile bubble of peace, a facade of pure, unadulterated normalcy. We were just a father and a son on a road trip, chasing the horizon for no reason other than to see if we could catch it. There was no hint, no foreshadowing, no chill in the air. The world, for all we knew, was exactly as it had always been, and this day was just another beautiful, unremarkable page in the story of our lives. We had no idea that the horizon we were chasing was about to collapse. We were driving, blissfully unaware, right towards the moment that would split all of time into a before and an after. The calm before the storm is a cliché, but only because it is so universally, terrifyingly true. And this was the most calm I had ever known. To understand why his words would later carry such immense, immediate weight, you have to understand the man he was. My father wasn't just quiet. His silence was a language all its own, one I'd spent a lifetime learning to interpret. He was a man carved from post-war oak and Midwestern pragmatism. He stood with a posture that seemed to defy entropy itself, his spine a rigid, unwavering line that spoke of military service he never discussed. His hands were a map of his life, broad, with thick, calloused fingers permanently etched with lines of grease that never quite washed out, and a faint, silvery scar across his knuckles from a long-ago encounter with a faulty carburetor. They were hands that could calibrate a delicate engine sensor with the precision of a surgeon, yet still gently fix the crooked wing of a moth I'd found as a child. His emotional landscape wasn't a flat, barren plain, as I'd foolishly thought in my youth. It was more like a deep, still lake. The surface was calm, often impenetrable, reflecting only what he chose to show the world. But beneath that placid surface existed profound depths, currents of loyalty, a fierce, protective love, and a wisdom that came not from books, but from a lifetime of observing how things work, both machines and people. He expressed care not through hugs or affirmations, but through action. A fixed leaky faucet in my first apartment. A meticulously researched file on 30-year mortgage rates when I was house hunting. His presence in that passenger seat on our annual trips. These were his declarations of love, his sermons. He was a man of routines and rituals. Every morning, his coffee was brewed in the same chipped ceramic pot, strong enough to stand a spoon in. Every newspaper was read front to back, the crossword puzzle completed in all capital letters with a specific brand of black ballpoint pen. He believed in the fundamental order of things. Every problem, from a squeaky floorboard to a personal dilemma, had a logical root cause and therefore a solution. Chaos was just a system he hadn't yet understood. This worldview was his armor, his compass. It had seen him through loss, through hardship, through the bewildering chaos of raising a son. He was my anchor, my fixed point in a turning world. Which is why the subtle shift was so jarring. That day on the road, his familiar silence had a new quality. It wasn't the comfortable, contemplative quiet I was used to. It was charged, preoccupied. He wasn't just watching the landscape. He was scanning it, his eyes, usually so calm and settled, now darting minutely from the road ahead to the vast emptiness around us, to the rearview mirror. The steady, relaxed tap of his fingers on the door had been replaced by a still, clenched fist resting on his knee. The lines on his face, usually just marks of age, seemed deeper, like fissures of unspoken tension. He hadn't said a word in over an hour, but the message was broadcasting loud and clear on a frequency only I could receive. Something was wrong. Not a "we have a flat tire" wrong. This was different. This was a deep, systemic wrongness that his engineer's mind had already identified, and it was causing a fundamental dissonance in his ordered universe. The lake's surface was still, but something massive was moving in the depths, and the water was beginning to chill around the edges. I remember wanting to ask, "You okay, Dad?" It was right there on my tongue. But I had been trained by him, by a lifetime of his example, to respect silence. To not fill the air with unnecessary noise. Asking would have been a violation of our unwritten code. So I drove. I kept my eyes on the road, stealing glances at him, trying to decipher the new, unsettling code of his posture, the set of his jaw. The perfect, golden normalcy of the day began to develop a hairline crack, and the unease seeped in, silent and cold. The anchor was still there, but the chain was straining. Topic 3. The unsettling command, "Pull over." Don't ask why. The words, when they finally came, did not feel like they originated inside the car. They felt like they fell from the sky. A sudden, cold meteorite crashing through the windshield and landing between us in the space that had, just moments before, been filled with nothing but heat haze and radio static. There was no preamble, No drawn-out sigh, no shifting in his seat to signal an impending conversation. One moment, the only sounds were the thrum-thrum-thrum of the tires and the distant, wailing steel guitar from the radio. The next, his voice cut through it all, clean and sharp as a shard of glass. Pull over. 2 words. Flat. Absolute. They weren't loud, but they carried a density, a gravitational pull that seemed to warp the very air inside the car. It was the voice he used not for me, but for emergencies. The voice for pointing out a deer about to leap into the road, or for telling me to hand him the fire extinguisher when the grill flared up. It was a voice that brooked no hesitation, a voice that demanded instantaneous muscle memory obedience. My body reacted before my mind could even begin to process the command. My foot lifted from the accelerator, hovering over the brake. My hands tightened on the warm vinyl of the steering wheel. My eyes instinctively flicked to the rearview mirror, then to the side mirror, scanning for a safe spot on the barren shoulder. It was a reaction drilled into me by a lifetime of his driving lessons. Asterisk, when I tell you to do something on the road, you do it first. Questions come later. Asterisk. But the shoulder was just a narrow strip of crumbling asphalt and dust, and there was nothing, no turnout, no rest stop, not even a wider bit of gravel. Just the endless stretch of desert and the relentless, straight line of the highway. My brain, finally catching up, began to rebel. Asterisk, pull over? Why? Asterisk, there was no logical reason. The car was running perfectly. No strange noises. No dashboard warning lights glowing an ominous amber. We weren't low on gas. There was no visible obstacle ahead. It made no sense within the framework of cause and effect he had always lived by. I opened my mouth. A question, any question, was forming on my lips. Asterisk, is everything all right? Do you feel sick? Did you see something? Asterisk, it was the natural, human response to a break in the established order. He didn't let me voice it. He didn't even turn his head to look at me. His gaze remained locked forward, fixed on that same distant, invisible point on the horizon, but his profile had hardened into something like granite. Don't ask why. The second part of the command landed with even more force than the first. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request for patience. It was a directive, issued with a quiet, terrifying finality. The why was not a privilege I was granted in that moment. It was a weight he was carrying alone, and he was telling me, in no uncertain terms, that I was not yet strong enough to help him bear it. The phrase hung in the air, sucking all the sound out of the car. Even the radio's crackle seemed to mute itself in deference. Don't ask why. It was the most unnerving thing he had ever said to me. It was an admission that the world's logic had failed. It was a crack in the very foundation of his being, and by extension, mine. Logic screamed. Every rational fiber of my being, every lesson he had ever taught me about assessing a situation, troubleshooting a problem, demanded an explanation. It was a dissonant clangor in my mind, a blaring alarm against the unnatural quiet of the car. Asterisk, this is irrational. This is unsafe. We are on a deserted highway. You do not just stop for no reason. Asterisk, my engineer father, the high priest of cause and effect, was violating his own most sacred doctrine. Yet my hands turned the steering wheel. It was not a conscious decision. It was something deeper, something programmed into my DNA long before I understood words like logic or risk assessment. It was the muscle memory of 1,000 childhood moments where that voice had been my sole compass in a confusing world. Asterisk, don't touch that, it's hot. Look both ways. Hold my hand. Asterisk. This was the ultimate test of that programming. This wasn't about a hot stove or a busy street. This was an abstract, terrifying unknown. And yet, the instinct to obey was older and stronger than the newfound adult voice of reason in my head. It was a trust built not on words, but on a lifetime of evidence. A trust forged in the unwavering certainty that this man, my father, would never act without purpose. His love had always been a practical, shielding force. If he said to stop, there was a reason. Even if that reason was, for now, invisible to me. The act of pulling over felt like moving through water, every motion slow and burdened. The tires crunched unnaturally loud on the gravel and dirt of the narrow shoulder, a sound that seemed to violate the sacred silence of the desert. I put the car in park. The engine idled, a low, ragged rumble that now sounded anxious, out of place. The great, gleaming hood of the Chevrolet pointed forward, no longer chasing the horizon but surrendered to it, aimless. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound out of the world. The thrum-thrum-thrum of the road was gone. The wind noise died. Even the radio seemed to hold its breath. It was a silence so complete it had a physical pressure, bearing down on my eardrums, on my chest. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world waiting for the other shoe to drop. Inside that stifling quiet, the war between trust and reason raged. My mind, desperate to reassert control, scrambled for a sane explanation. Asterisk, did he have a heart attack? Is he about to be sick? Asterisk, I risked a glance at him. His chest rose and fell steadily. His hands, now clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees, were still. He was perfectly, terrifyingly composed. This was no medical emergency. The reality was far more unnerving. This was a crisis of knowledge. He knew something catastrophic. And in that moment, the weight I felt wasn't the fear of the unknown thing itself. It was the immense, crushing weight of the trust he had placed in me by asking for my blind obedience, and the even greater weight of the trust one was placing in him by giving it. It was a sacred, silent transaction between us, a transfer of faith that bypassed all reason. I had handed the reins of my reality over to him, and the car, now still and silent on the side of that endless road, was the tangible proof of that surrender. We were no longer moving forward. We were suspended, trapped in a moment of awful, pregnant silence, waiting for the world to prove my trust was well placed. Logic screamed. Every rational fiber of my being, every lesson he had ever taught me about assessing a situation, troubleshooting a problem, demanded an explanation. It was a dissonant clangor in my mind, a blaring alarm against the unnatural quiet of the car. Asterisk, this is irrational. This is unsafe. We are on a deserted highway. You do not just stop for no reason. Asterisk, my engineer father, the high priest of cause and effect, was violating his own most sacred doctrine. Yet my hands turned the steering wheel. It was not a conscious decision. It was something deeper, something programmed into my DNA long before I understood words like logic or risk assessment. It was the muscle memory of 1,000 childhood moments where that voice had been my sole compass in a confusing world. Asterisk, don't touch that, it's hot. Look both ways. Hold my hand. Asterisk. This was the ultimate test of that programming. This wasn't about a hot stove or a busy street. This was an abstract, terrifying unknown. And yet, the instinct to obey was older and stronger than the newfound adult voice of reason in my head. It was a trust built not on words, but on a lifetime of evidence. A trust forged in the unwavering certainty that this man, my father, would never act without purpose. His love had always been a practical, shielding force. If he said to stop, there was a reason. Even if that reason was, for now, invisible to me, the act of pulling over felt like moving through water, every motion slow and burdened. The tires crunched unnaturally loud on the gravel and dirt of the narrow shoulder, a sound that seemed to violate the sacred silence of the desert. I put the car in park. The engine idled, a low, ragged rumble that now sounded anxious, out of place. The great, gleaming hood of the Chevrolet pointed forward, no longer chasing the horizon but surrendered to it, aimless. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound out of the world. The thrum-thrum-thrum of the road was gone. The wind noise died. Even the radio seemed to hold its breath. It was a silence so complete it had a physical pressure, bearing down on my eardrums, on my chest. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world waiting for the other shoe to drop. Inside that stifling quiet, the war between trust and reason raged. My mind, desperate to reassert control, scrambled for a sane explanation. Asterisk, did he have a heart attack? Is he about to be sick? Asterisk, I risked a glance at him. His chest rose and fell steadily. His hands, now clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees, were still. He was perfectly, terrifyingly composed. This was no medical emergency. The reality was far more unnerving. This was a crisis of knowledge. He knew something catastrophic. And in that moment, the weight I felt wasn't the fear of the unknown thing itself. It was the immense, crushing weight of the trust he had placed in me by asking for my blind obedience, and the even greater weight of the trust one was placing in him by giving it. It was a sacred, silent transaction between us, a transfer of faith that bypassed all reason. I had handed the reins of my reality over to him, and the car, now still and silent on the side of that endless road, was the tangible proof of that surrender. We were no longer moving forward. We were suspended, trapped in a moment of awful, pregnant silence, waiting for the world to prove my trust was well placed. The moment the car settled into its stillness, the world didn't just get quiet, it changed. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, muting the frequency of reality itself. The familiar, comforting sounds of the journey, the steady hum of the engine, the rhythmic whir of the tires, the whoosh of air rushing past the windows, were violently amputated, leaving behind a void so absolute it felt like a physical presence in the car. This new silence was not peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy, and alien. It pressed in on the windows, a thick, invisible fog that isolated us in our own little bubble of suspended animation. The faint, dusty smell of the desert interior, usually a background note, now seemed amplified, clogging the air we breathed. I could hear the faint tick-tick-tick of the engine as it cooled, contracting metal singing a tiny, anxious song. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, a frantic, trapped drum against the stillness. I could hear the soft, almost imperceptible rustle of my father's denim jacket as he took a slow, measured breath. Time itself became distorted, elastic. Each second stretched out into a minute, each minute into an hour. I stared at a single juniper tree about 100 yards away, and it felt like I could watch each individual needle absorb the sunlight in real time. A tumbleweed, frozen in a barbed wire fence, became a monument to our own stasis. The world outside the windshield was a magnificent, sprawling painting, vivid, breathtaking, and utterly still. It was no longer a landscape we were moving through. It was a diorama we were trapped in. Inside the car, the silence became a third occupant, vast and unignorable. It sat in the back seat, breathing down our necks. It was a silence that demanded to be filled, yet screamed that any sound would be a profanity, a violation of some unspoken rule. My throat itched to clear itself. My fingers twitched with the urge to turn the radio knob, to search for a human voice, any voice, to shatter this unbearable vacuum. But I didn't move. I didn't dare. My father's own silence was a fortress. He remained statue still, his gaze fixed forward, but his eyes were no longer seeing the mesa or the sky. They were turned inward, focused on some internal calculation, some dreadful arithmetic only he could see. The tension in the car was a live wire, sparking between us without a single word being exchanged. It was a conversation of held breaths, of white knuckles, of postures braced for an impact we couldn't see coming. This was the silence of a breath held before a scream. It was the silence at the apex of a roller coaster, the terrible, weightless pause before the plummet. It was the silence of a hospital waiting room. It was the most deafening sound I have ever heard. The world, in all its vast, beautiful grandeur, was holding its breath, and we were stuck at the very center of it, waiting for the universe to exhale. The silence was a taut wire, stretched to its breaking point, vibrating with a pitch so high it was almost beyond hearing. And then the wire snapped. It was the radio that did it. We had never turned it off. In the stillness, its low, static-laced murmur had faded into the background, just another part of the eerie new normal. But then, the static crackled, not with the usual hiss of poor reception, but with a jarring, percussive pop, the sound of a station being forcibly interrupted. A shrill, piercing tone erupted from the speakers, a mechanical screech that made us both flinch. It was the emergency alert system tone, a sound engineered to bypass conscious thought and trigger a primal jolt of alarm deep in the lizard brain. It was a sound you heard during tests and immediately forgot. But you never forgot it when it was real. The tone cut out, and for one heart-stopping second, there was dead air. Then, a voice. It was a man's voice, the one from the classic country station. But the folksy, relaxed cadence was gone. It was stripped raw, stripped down to a brittle, professional urgency that was far more terrifying than any shout could ever be. "We interrupt this broadcast." The voice began, the words clipped and too fast. My eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on my father. He didn't move a muscle, but his jaw tightened, a tiny, painful-looking spasm. He was waiting. He knew. The voice continued, and the words that came out of the tinny speakers began to paint a picture of impossible horror. They were cold, clinical terms used to describe something utterly apocalyptic. The reporter spoke of an event, a catastrophic geological instability. He used numbers, scales, coordinates that meant nothing to me but everything to him. He talked about coastlines, about evacuation zones that spanned hundreds of miles, about a wave that measured not in feet, but in stories. It wasn't just news. It was an obituary for the world we had been driving through just minutes before. The details are a blur even now, a nightmare collage of phrases. Unprecedented magnitude, widespread devastation expected. All citizens urged to seek high ground immediately. The voice started to break. A crack appeared in the professional facade. "My God," he whispered, and the two words, so human, so shattered, were more devastating than all the official jargon. There was a sound of papers shuffling, a choked breath near the microphone, and then the broadcast dissolved into a wave of pure, screaming static. The static poured into the car, filling the void left by the silence. But it was 1,000 times worse. It was the sound of chaos, the sound of a system breaking down, the sound of the end. I finally turned my head, my neck moving stiffly, like a rusted hinge. I looked at my father. The news bulletin wasn't news to him. It was a confirmation. The tension that had been coiling in him for hours had been the dread of this exact moment. He wasn't reacting with shock or panic. His face was a mask of profound, weary grief. He had been carrying this terrible potentiality, and now the burden was real. He had stopped the car not to hear the news, but to ensure we were safely stopped when the world heard it. He had known that such a truth, delivered at 70 miles per hour, could be a death sentence all its own. The news didn't just break over the radio. It broke over his face, and in that moment, I saw the old world die in his eyes. The static from the radio was a torrent of digital screams, a horrifying white noise that was the audible form of pure chaos. It filled the car, a stark, abrasive contrast to the sacred silence we had just occupied. It was the sound of the world fracturing. And in the center of that storm, my father moved. It wasn't a large movement. It was slow, deliberate, almost tectonic. He turned his head from the windshield, from the vast, unknowing landscape that was now a tomb for a past life. His movement was heavy, as if the gravity in the car had tripled, each degree of rotation requiring immense effort against an invisible weight. His eyes met mine. It was not the glance of a parent reassuring a child. There was no there in that look. It was not a look of shared panic or wide-eyed fear. It was something else entirely, something deeper, more ancient, and more devastating. In that single, prolonged look, an entire conversation transpired. A lifetime of words that had never been spoken were transmitted in a blast of pure, unvarnished understanding. His eyes, usually the color of a steady, gray sky, were now the color of a storm-ravaged sea. In them, I saw a profound and terrible apology. I am sorry. I am sorry this is the world you inherit. I am sorry the road ends here. I saw the crushing weight of a protector who could not protect his child from this, who could only shield him from the moment of impact, not the impact itself. I saw a deep, gut-wrenching grief, not just for what was happening, but for all that was now irrevocably lost. The future he had imagined for me, the simple, quiet continuance of life, a career, a family, a future of your own road trips. It all evaporated in the heat of that glance. He was mourning my future in real time. But more than anything, I saw a fierce, blazing, and unwavering certainty. The glance held no question, no doubt. It was an affirmation. Asterisk, this is real. What you just heard is real. The world has fundamentally and permanently changed. Asterisk, it was the look of a man who had spent a lifetime building his reality on the bedrock of facts, and he was now handing me the most terrible fact of all. He was not asking me to believe the voice on the radio. He was demanding that I understand the truth he had already accepted. And in return, my own look, wide-eyed, breath caught in my throat, the world tilting on its axis, must have communicated 1,000 questions, a tsunami of fear and disbelief. But his gaze held mine, steadying me, absorbing my terror. He was the lightning rod for my shock. He didn't flinch. He let me see the full, horrifying depth of his knowledge, and in doing so, he made it ours to bear. Together, the screaming static was just noise. The real communication, the transfer of the unbearable truth, happened in the absolute silence of that shared look. It was the most intimate and terrifying moment of our lives. He wasn't my father explaining something to his son. He was one man who saw what was coming, locking eyes with another, ensuring he did not have to face it alone. The glance said everything the radio could not. It said, I know, and now you know, and we are here. The static continued its mindless shriek, a stark counterpoint to the profound silence that had passed between us. It was my father who moved first. His hand, the one with the silvery scar, reached out, not with a jerk, but with a slow, weary finality. His fingers turned the knob on the radio. The sound didn't fade. It was severed. The sudden, absolute quiet that followed was somehow louder and more shocking than the noise had been. He let his hand fall back to his knee. He didn't look at the radio. He continued to look at me, but the storm in his eyes had settled into a deep, grim calm. He had delivered the worst of it. Now it was time for the explanation. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy, stripped of all ornamentation. It was the voice of a man reporting facts from a disaster site. He would have done the math, he began, as if we were in the middle of a conversation. There was no sun, no preamble. The man on the radio, he would have known the approximate wave speed, the time it would take. He paused, his eyes losing focus for a second, seeing numbers and equations on the inside of his skull. The initial shock, the panic, that's when most accidents happen. Not from the event itself, from the reaction to it. His gaze sharpened and returned to me, drilling the lesson home. People hearing that, on the road, they slam on the brakes, they swerve, they freeze. They cause pileups that block the roads for the people who need to get out. They die in their cars, not from water or fire, but from fear. He took a slow, measured breath, his chest rising and falling with a deliberate rhythm that seemed to be consciously fighting off the chaos. A man needs to be stopped, feet on solid ground, not hurtling forward in a metal box. You need to be still to hear news like that. You need to be still to process it, to make a plan, not reacting. Thinking. He finally gestured vaguely toward the empty, peaceful-looking desert outside the window. Out here, we're safe from that, at least. From the panic of others. We have time. We have space. We can think. And there it was. The root cause. The logical solution. His final, greatest act of practical protection. It had nothing to do with superstition or a premonition. It was a cold, brutal engineering assessment of human nature under extreme duress. He hadn't felt a mystical dread. He'd calculated the probability of mass hysteria. He wasn't shielding me from the news. He was shielding me from the reaction to the news. He had pulled us over to create a contained environment, a safe laboratory in which to receive the catastrophic data, ensuring the subject, us, wouldn't be compromised by external variables like traffic or high speed. It was the most profoundly him thing he could have possibly done. In the face of Armageddon, his first and only instinct was to troubleshoot, to isolate the problem, to implement a safety protocol. His love wasn't expressed in hugs or comforting words in that moment. It was expressed in the ruthless, practical efficiency of having potentially saved our lives by simply pulling over to the side of the road. He had fixed the one thing he could still control, our physical position in the moment of impact. It was his masterpiece of practical love. The engine turned over with a sound that was obscenely normal. I put the car in drive. My hands were numb on the wheel. We pulled back onto the asphalt, but we were not resuming our trip. We were embarking on an entirely new journey across an alien planet that just happened to look exactly like the old one. The same sun poured its golden light over the mesa. The same juniper trees stood in silent witness. The same strip of gray highway unspooled ahead of us. But it was all a lie. A beautiful, painted backdrop on a stage after the play had ended in tragedy. The beauty was still there, but it was now horrific in its indifference. The world had ended, and the landscape hadn't even noticed. We drove. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. The anxious, waiting silence was gone. It had been replaced by a thick, heavy silence of absorption, of shock settling deep into the marrow. There was nothing left to say. The facts were the facts. The news bulletin had drawn a line through time itself, and we were now living in the after. I kept driving, but I was no longer navigating by the sun or the road signs. I was navigating by his instructions, delivered in that same flat, pragmatic tone. We'll need to find higher ground. Look for a route east, away from the basin. We need to conserve fuel. No more than 55 miles an hour. His voice was a GPS recalculating a route through hell. Every word was practical, devoid of emotion, focused solely on the variables of survival. Elevation, distance, resources. The goal was no longer a destination on a map. It was simply a way. Away from the inevitable tide of panic that would soon flood the highways as the news spread. Away from the low-lying areas that were now death traps. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, was now a potential gauntlet. Every car we saw in the distance, every speck on the horizon, was no longer a fellow traveler. It was a potential threat, a vector of the coming chaos. The peace of the journey was annihilated. The comfort we'd found in the shared silence was replaced by a hyper-vigilant watchfulness. I watched the road. He watched the map, the sky, the empty horizon, his engineer's mind constantly running new calculations, assessing risks I couldn't even fathom yet. We were still father and son in a car, but we were no longer on a road trip. We were refugees in our own country. The car was no longer a vessel of discovery. It was a lifeboat on a suddenly treacherous sea. We were moving forward, but we were leaving everything behind. Not just our homes or our possessions, but our past, our future, our understanding of how the world worked. We were driving into a new, terrifying reality, and the only compass we had was the quiet, steady voice of my father, calmly navigating the end of the world. We never did find high ground that day. Not in the geographical sense. The event, while catastrophic, was not the world-ender the initial panicked bulletin had suggested. It was a localized tragedy of unimaginable scale, but local nonetheless. The waves did not reach the desert. The panic on the highways did, but by then, we were already off the main arteries, sheltered in the quiet safety of a small, confused town, listening to the corrected, yet still horrifying, reports on a dusty diner's television. But that's not the point of the story. The event itself, the news, the facts, they have faded with time, becoming a historical footnote, a tragedy we all remember in the abstract. What did not fade was the lesson of the pullover. It became my father's final and greatest gift to me. It wasn't about that specific crisis. It was a masterclass in how to confront any cataclysm, great or small. In the years that followed, life delivered its inevitable blows. The kind that shake your personal world. A devastating diagnosis, the sudden collapse of a career, the profound grief of loss. In those moments, when the terrifying news breaks over the phone or in a doctor's office, I never panic. I never swerve. I hear his voice. Pull over. Don't ask why. And I do. I literally, physically stop. If I'm driving, I find a place to park. If I'm at work, I close my office door. If I'm home, I sit down. I come to a complete and utter stop. I allow the shockwave to hit me not while I'm in motion, but when I am braced, when my feet are on solid ground. I don't ask why. Not immediately. The why is a luxury for later, for when the initial tsunami has receded. The first duty is to survive the impact, to be still, to process the sheer fact of the new, terrible reality without the added danger of momentum. Then, I hear his calm, engineering voice in my head, troubleshooting the crisis of the moment. Asterisk, isolate the variables. Conserve your emotional fuel. Seek high ground. Who can you call for support? Navigate away from the panic. What is the one, single, next right thing to do? Asterisk, he taught me that the world's chaos is inevitable, but our reaction to it is not. The most powerful thing you can do in the face of a system-shattering event is to deliberately, consciously, bring your own system to a halt, to create a contained space for the disaster, so it doesn't spill out and poison everything else. My father is gone now, but on every road I travel, he is in the passenger seat, and his lesson is my compass. The world will always break. The news will always shock. But now I know the protocol. I don't fight the chaos. I simply pull over, let it wash past, and then, once I'm steady, I carefully, deliberately, find a new way forward. He taught me that survival isn't about speed. It's about stillness. It's the ultimate act of practical love, and it is his enduring legacy.